Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Richardson. I'm a trustee of South Georgia Heritage Trust, and I was intimately involved in the South Georgia project. The session this afternoon, though, is much closer to home, with a very Scottish flavour. In the days before I sort of wore this sort of rig, I actually spent 20 years, almost 20 years, in Shetland, dealing both with Shetland and the island group of Orkney, so I'm fairly acquainted with some of the islands. So we have 4 talks this afternoon, all dealing with mammals, and 3 of them with a scattering of Scottish islands. The first presentation this afternoon is by Charlotte Main, who will talk to us about the eradication of black rats on the SHIANTS.
Can I speak? Can you hear me? So you know your conference has been inspired by South Georgia when you find a bottle of whiskey in your conference bag. There'll be some people in the audience who know what I mean by that in particular. So the eradication of black rats on the Shan't Isles is one of the central aims of the Shan't Isles Seabird Recovery Project, which is a 4-year partnership project between the Nicholson family, who own the Shants, between Scottish Natural Heritage and RSPB, and funding was provided by the Life Fund, by Scottish Natural Heritage, and through private donations through the RSPB. WMIL carried out the rat eradication with our support, but not only that, the support of about 15 volunteers on the islands and more based on Harris and Lewis, who without their help, the whole thing would have been impossible. And when you think about spending a winter on an uninhabited rock in the North Atlantic with no proper toilet, that is a really humbling thought. It sounds dramatic. We did have a system, but there isn't time to go into that here. So this is what I'm going to say. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Shan't Isles, introduce them to you, and then try and tell, in the very short amount of time, the story of the setup and the operation of the eradication. I'll tell you where we're at now, tell the stage, and then just wrap up. So that's where the Shan't Isles are. You'll know from Biz's talk. So you've got a profile of the islands there, seen as you're approaching from the boat from Stornoway to the north. They're in between Skye and the island of Harris and Lewis, about 6 kilometres off the island of Lewis. And hopefully you can see from that aerial shot that the islands consist of 3 main islands, 2 of which, House and Rough, are connected by a boulder causeway. Of course, they do have Gaelic names, but I'm not going to pronounce them here. I'm bad enough at public speaking as it is without tripping over Gaelic names. So those 2 islands are connected by a boulder causeway. You've got Mary Island off to the east and a little set of sea stacks to the west called the Galters. So hopefully you can see from that aerial photograph that the islands are uninhabited. There's no infrastructure there. In fact, there's only one standing structure, which is a bothy on House Island, on the only bit of flat ground on the islands as well. There's a lot of very steep terrain. There's a lot of vegetated cliffs. There's this huge area of boulder scree along the east side of Rough Island, about 700 metres of boulders that have toppled down from the cliffs above. And that makes an enormous, huge, fantastic area of breeding habitat for seabirds. And of course, until recently, a population of accidentally introduced black rats. The other main seabirds on the colonies tend to be distributed quite widely around the coasts. There are 2 big puffin colonies, one at the top of Rough Island and another on Mary Island. So they're a pretty kind of amazing, special place. What makes it special though? Well, really it is, of course, the protected seabird assemblage, protected under EU and UK law as an SPA and SSSI. So that is for huge populations of auks, an estimated 62,500 or so breeding pairs of UK puffins. So really important UK breeding colony for puffins, but also other auks, kittiwakes, shags, fulmar. There's been white-tailed eagles establishing themselves as breeding at the island since 2013. There's also lots of very interesting plants, a diversity of land birds and waders. They're also designated as part of the SSSI for their interesting geology. They're primarily igneous intrusion of dolerite, so it results in these incredibly tall, steep, giant's causeway-like columns that are very impressive and beautiful. There's also some conglomerate substrate there too, but mainly igneous rock. So they're interesting geology and interesting archaeology evidence. You can't really see it, but that donut-shaped piece of ground that's pictured up there is a medieval turf hut. There's a whole village of these on the top of Mary Island. It's fantastic to stand in an old front room of somebody from medieval times. So you can see in that picture down there again, that's taken from Mary Island looking at House and Rough. You can see the cliffs and the big Baldur's area, hopefully. Very exciting place. So just going on to the eradication preparations. The project began late in 2014, and we had about 9 months or so to get all of the eradication preparations ready. And that kicked off when I came to manage the project in February 2015, preparing and then undertaking a big monitoring season. We monitored the seabird productivity of main species of interest at the SHIANTS and in different colonies, looking at different habitats. We did vegetation surveys and collected samples for crawling invertebrates. We also did land bird transects and monitored everything that anybody ever saw or got written down. We had to go through a great big long process of applying for all sorts of permissions and licenses so that we could carry out the work. And that involved taking archaeologists to the islands so that we could be sure that we would not disturb any of the sensitive archaeology. That was also so that we could put in for planning permissions so that these cabin structures could be airlifted out to the SHIANTS so that we could build camps to station volunteers and to keep the equipment safe over the winter. And so we needed a site survey for that. We had to go through a full operations requiring consent process with SNH, in which the favoured bait choice, which was bromodiolone, and the method of application and the quantity required, and talking about avoiding secondary poisoning for non-target species. All of this had to be fully documented and laid out in a long document to SNH, who then had to grant their permission for us to use rodenticide on the SPA and the SSSI. So another very important part of the setup was WMIL coming to do a pre-assessment visit at the islands. We set out this figure here shows a few lines of snap traps where we caught some of the black rats to get DNA samples for rodenticide resistance testing. So like that was an incredibly busy and intense period. Lots of work needed to be done in the run-up phase of that kind of ilk. We had volunteer involvement at that stage of the process as well, fortunately, to make hundreds and hundreds of base stations. We had to make around about 1,200 to cover the full area of the islands, and about 700 of those were made by volunteers in the Harris Volunteer Centre in Tarbet, with the help of kind volunteers there. And then we ended up with seas of bags of bait stations and the rodenticide, which a lot of which had to be airlifted out to the SHIANTS over 2 days using PDG helicopters. So here are some pictures demonstrating that. You've got the establishment of the winter camp behind the Bothy structure there. 2 cabins were airlifted in there, loads of equipment. A third cabin was set up on the smallest main island, Mary Island, and they formed the 2 camps. The camp on House was stationed by staff and volunteers for the entire operation with a small break for Christmas. And on Mary Island, the camp there was there for most of the time, but it lagged behind its treatment in terms of the eradication very slightly, because every week we had this transfer of parts of the team around between a break period on Lewis, Harris, and one of the two islands so that teams could move around, and there was sort of a constant kind of change in people's circumstances in that way. We also had a lot of very steep ground to deal with at the SHIANTS, and this is part of the project that really interested me, being a hobby climber. We fortunately had enough funds and the expertise to commission Stuart Johnson, who's shown there, to do a week's remote rope access training. And we not only learned the physical nuts and bolts of descending and ascending ropes on steep surfaces, but he also taught us and showed us, and we physically did plenty of actual bolting of rocks with bolts, and we learned how to set up secure anchors in soft ground, lashing together stakes in this picket design shown down there. So all of that was very fascinating, but a completely and utterly necessary part of the project when you've got to be accessing vegetated slopes and near vertical. So at that point in the proceedings, my physical involvement with the project reduced for a time so that I could give birth to my daughter. And the team, I was replaced then for a time by Tom Churchyard. They went and carried on and set up the bait station grid. So this shows all of the bait stations on the ground. The interval was 50 metres over the main sort of area of ground, reducing to 25 metres, in areas of predicted high rat density, so through the big boulder scree area and along areas that were basically seabird colonies and around the coasts. And you can see also we've got bait stations laid out on the Galter sea stacks as well. And then trying to sort of aim at my target audience to save a bit of time, we had a sort of quite standard baiting rounds of baiting, followed by intensive monitoring over the period of the 6-month operation. Initially, rodenticide blocks were put loose in the bait stations, and rats were encouraged to remove them and cache them. Then they were wired in, and we'd had a period of time where an alternative bait, Kumatetrol, was used as an alternative bait for the rats. All this took place in extremely bad weather at times, sometimes bad enough to stop operations, and on very steep terrain, even like outside of all the rope access routes. They were wet, grassy slopes ending in very sort of precipitous drops in many parts of the island. So quite an exciting, risky place. So yeah, just to highlight the fact that, the islands are uninhabited, so we didn't have to deal with residents per se, and that wasn't our challenge. Our challenge on the SHIANTS was really complex logistics and very challenging access at the cliff sites and sea stacks. So just a quick look at the results.
Charlotte,
sorry.
I'm very conscious that I will get told off by our overall chairman. And we've got 3 more talks this afternoon.
Okay,
so
yeah,
if
sorry.
you could just wind up, please.
Yep, okay, well, that's a look at the results heat map, as you saw earlier. Currently, we're looking at the monitoring using 44 stations, and there has been no rat sign to date, and our final checks planned for February 2018. Sorry about that, I think I was a bit late starting.
Thank you for that, Charlotte.
Okay.
Our second talk this afternoon is on what is one of the most pernicious of the UK's invasives, which is grey squirrels. And I think this one's dealing with grey squirrels in Scotland overall. And that's from Mel Tonkin. Thank you, Mel.
Okay, so we're scaling up the challenge here to the mainland situation, and we have to go beyond thinking about eradication here. So we're looking at the containment of invasive grey squirrels from the point of view entirely of protecting red squirrels, important populations, UK populations of red squirrels. So for those of you who are not familiar with the situation, these 2 maps kind of sum up the catastrophic decline of red squirrels over perhaps the last 100, 130 odd years. So wherever grey squirrels were introduced by Victorians in the kind of the late 19th century, and they instantly established, really liked the habitat, began to spread, and as they did so, they're doing this at the expense of red squirrels. So complete displacement. So by the time 100 years has elapsed, there are hardly any red squirrels left in England and Wales, apart from the northern two counties of England. And so Scotland remains one of the places with the only large populations of red squirrels that occur without grey squirrels. So the whole premise of the work rests on the fact that red squirrels are identified on the UK Biodiversity Action Plan as a priority species. And because their main threat really is grey squirrels, this is where this evolves from. So this is followed up in Scotland by a strategy for dealing with the issues and establishing the current whereabouts, the current distributions of red and grey squirrels at the time, which is quite a challenge on a large scale, on a Scotland-wide basis. And then finally, once we'd established this, this project, Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels, was launched in 2009. So we're now into our 9th year on the project. So the partnership, I can't emphasize, the partnership has been really important. It's been really key to being able to deliver this thing at all. So I work for Scottish Wildlife Trust, and we are responsible for the day-to-day delivery and running of the project. But we also have on board a body that's responsible for nature conservation policy in Scotland, the body that's responsible for regulating squirrel habitats, and a body that represents landowners. All of these are really critical. And then more recently, we've been joined by Royal Society for Protection of Birds in Scotland when they upscaled their remit from just birds to all of nature. And they're a really influential partner, so we're really pleased to have them. And then also a small, very local, very specific red squirrel only conservation charity in the UK. So looking at Scotland as if it's an island here, I was pretending I wanted to fit in with you guys. On the left, the distribution of red squirrels, kind of when we started the project, roughly. So we're looking at still very widespread red squirrel populations in pretty much all the wooded habitat of Scotland, except very noticeably, if I can actually find where the pointy thing is. Nope, I haven't. I've got to click too far on. The central lowlands, Edinburgh, Glasgow, is an area where red squirrels have disappeared probably in the last 30 years. On the right-hand side, grey squirrel distribution, so not an inconsiderable, I think that's the right double negative, not an inconsiderable challenge really to get rid of grey squirrels on that sort of scale. So in Scotland, the mechanism for replacement has been purely by competition for living space, for food resources. The grey squirrel is more than twice the size, a big, robust animal, and a very formidable competitor for the red squirrel. And then moving in across the border, the southern borders in about 2005, came this disease, squirrel pox. Now, this is a virus which is carried asymptomatically by grey squirrels, but is lethal to reds, very, very rapidly lethal to reds. Modelling work has been done which shows that once you've got squirrel pox in the mix, then the replacement rate of reds by greys takes place about 20 to 25 times as fast. So it was perceived as being a real acceleration of the threat that we've faced to date. However, that said, competition alone is enough for greys to replace reds. So how are we going about this? Well, eradication really on the scale of Scotland is out of the question, just expense-wise and very logistically and so forth. So we've gone for a strategic approach which varies depending on the landscape where we're seeing the squirrels. Now, let me see if I can find this pointy thing. Is it here? Here we go. So first of all, we've got an isolated population of grey squirrels centred on Aberdeen. There we are going for eradication. Not quite as simple as on an island. I know you're going to probably be wanting to kick me afterwards for saying it's simple, but because we've always got land around where these animals can keep expanding out to, and you've got to keep mopping up where you've already done the eradicating. And then right across the centre of Scotland, along the Highland Line, which is a geological boundary which give us a sort of topographical assistance in containing grey squirrels to the south of that line. Sorry. Where are we going? There we go. The idea really is to prevent grey squirrels from getting any further north than that line, and where they do, mopping up the ones that get to the north of that. So the priority really is to protect those red squirrels that currently exist without threat from grey squirrels in the Highlands of Scotland. In the south of Scotland, we've opted for just selecting some landscapes where we depress the numbers of grey squirrels to a level where they cannot replace the red squirrels. So it's protection of red squirrels in certain landscapes. So we need because we've got two very similar species, congeners in fact, we need a selective method for controlling grey squirrels. So we have to use live trapping, which the traps need checking twice a day so that we're releasing non-target animals, including red squirrel, but also for the welfare of grey squirrel. This is really labour intensive. Now, initially, nobody actually knew whether you could depress grey squirrels to the point where you're not just harvesting a surplus. So we've done a lot of monitoring. We're a very data-rich project. We've collected trapping and trapping results that we're subjecting to all sorts of analyses. We do annual presence-absence surveys at over 200 sites, which we each run for 6 weeks. This is, again, very labour-intensive. And we encourage the public to submit sightings on a kind of online reporting form. And that's really important to give a much wider context and to pick up sort of early signs of squirrels turning up where we haven't seen them before. So delivery, we have our own staff team. So we have conservation officers who are out there engaging and encouraging, supporting landowners and volunteers to contribute to our efforts. We have bespoke professional grey squirrel control officers who are patrolling and fill in a lot of areas where we can't get landowners and people to work, and including Aberdeen, where they're working within houses and gardens and parks and so forth. But really key across the Highland Line and in the south is networks of landowners who are funded on 5-year contracts by Scottish Rural Development Funding, which is a European-based fund. We also run a trap loan scheme, which is very successful, have been really critical in Aberdeen City for depressing the number of grey squirrels there. So, I mean, I've written in red, crucial role of survey volunteers. I think that's probably going to come out again and again in these talks. It certainly has so far, and this is really no exception. So, just very briefly, looking at some of the outcomes of the work to date, well, these are looking at 2 different time windows, red on the left-hand side, obviously in red, and greys in blue. We have actually halted the decline of red squirrels in the project areas. That does seem to be something that we have achieved to date, at any rate. Not only have we halted the decline, but we find that red squirrel populations are actually thriving in areas where grey squirrels have been depressed to low levels and are returning to areas where they haven't, they've been disappeared for several decades in some cases. We're also achieving reductions in grey squirrel range, which you can actually see to some extent in this map here, certainly around Aberdeen, along the Highland Line as well. There's far lower distribution of grey squirrels to the north. But there are certainly areas where grey squirrels have continued to expand their range outside the project footprint. So we've had quite a lot of analysis done, but there's not really time to go into how that's been done at the moment. But we have got evidence we've been able to demonstrate quite conclusively that grey squirrel abundance has significantly declined in our a couple of study landscapes. But we have a mass of other evidence which contributes to that as well. Oh, the challenges. I mean, it is a big challenge because obviously to make all the work that we've done so far worthwhile, 8 years of work so far, it's essential to sustain this effort long term, and we're talking about decades here into the future. This has been, the fundraising by the Scottish Wildlife Trust is becoming increasingly challenging as time goes on, for raising funds for the same project year on year. There are current issues with the Rural Development Programme funding as it is at the moment, which is, we're very grateful for, but it's not perfect. But, then we've got the implications of the British withdrawal from the EU. What happens to, there's great uncertainties about where similar funding might come from after Brexit happens. So there are opportunities, however. We have just secured 5 years funding in advance, which is a total luxury. Normally we're fundraising as we go along, from Heritage Lottery Fund, which for 5 years of really intensive work, expanding our interaction with communities and upskilling communities to assist us in our work. Have I got time to go? How long do I have? Oh, we're on red. So we haven't got time to go into pine martens. Somebody else might talk about that. So we're aiming really to intensively invest in the upskilling of local volunteers and landowners and training them up to actually take over from us in some of the areas so that we're then able to scale down our staff team, particularly in the south of Scotland, where we've got this existing problem of grey squirrels, but also we hope in Aberdeen, when we get nearer to an eradication stage, in which case we need to then replace the grey squirrel control work with some kind of robust monitoring and rapid response. But we can't foresee much scope for reducing the work along the Central Highland line. That is always going to need staff, and I think we're kind of there. I'll leave you to read that bit. Oh, no, I'm not going, because I need to acknowledge my funders. Time for questions?
Thank you, Mel, for that. Actually, I have got time, I think, for 1 or 2 questions.
Gosh, you're rude.
There's one at the back there.
Can I make one comment? We've got grey and red squirrel just west of Dundee, and their numbers seem to have gone down, and that seems to be, you haven't commented, you said you might have, in the introduction of pine marten. They've come in big style, and I think it's also helpful. Any comments that you would like to make on that?
So was there a question attached to that? It was to do with the differential effect that pine martens, which are recovering from persecution, have on our grey squirrels. And there's quite a lot of work going on at the moment to actually explore what that differential is and whether it applies everywhere. But certainly it's allowing red squirrels to recover in areas where pine marten densities have built up. So quite a really interesting thing to keep an eye on.
Any other question?
How is the pox virus spread?
We think it's by body fluid, so probably face wiping during marking, scent marking on branches, that kind of thing, we think. We can't find a vector. We have looked at it in other mammals as reservoirs and birds as well, but it just seems to be a grey squirrel thing.
One more quickly.
Is there not scope for a public works type of program where the unemployed people get work to do this kind of option? We have 97,000 people doing that in our conservation project.
Well, yeah, that's a question I'm probably not qualified to answer. Yeah, so it's engagement. About getting the word out to the whole breadth of the community is really quite a challenge. At the moment, we're kind of preaching to the converted in rural areas where people are seeing their red squirrels disappear, and we have red squirrels on the doorstep waiting to come back. So, but yes.
Okay, thanks.
Possibility to consider.
Thanks once again, Mel. Thanks. Well, in our third presentation, we're back to the islands again, and I think this afternoon we've got a double act between Sarah Sankey and Graham Neville, and we're now dealing with STOATS on Orkney. Thank you.
Thank you. It is indeed a double act, so I promise not to sing, but I can't say anything about Sarah. I'm Graham Neville. I'm Operations Manager for Scottish Natural Heritage, and I've been working with colleagues in RSPB Scotland to pull together a project called the Orkney Native Wildlife Project to deal with the stoat incursion in Orkney. The Orkney Archipelago, for those who don't know, it's 10 kilometres north of the northern coast of mainland Scotland, and it's about 53,000 hectares, so a really pretty large area. The first sighting of stoats was in June 2010, and that was confirmed in August 2010. We don't know how the stoats got to Orkney, possible deliberate release or potentially stowaway in straw or hay shipped to the island. Orkney is a fantastic place for native wildlife. The extent of European and national designation, international designation on the Orkney Islands is shown here. We have only 0.4 of the landmass of the UK, but 14% of breeding kittiwake, 34% of Arctic skua, 10% puffin, 25% of Arctic tern, 14% of the global population of breeding great skua. In particular, Orkney is a stronghold for hen harrier and short-eared owl. In fact, it supports 20% of the UK population of hen harrier. Orkney is a stronghold for breeding waders, including curlew. Of course, the curlew is the UK's highest priority species for conservation concern. And in Orkney, we also have an endemic subspecies of the Orkney vole, of the vole, the Orkney vole. And so, a fantastic place. In 2011, we tried to remove quite quickly the two populations of stoats in Orkney using volunteers live trapping and translocating the stoats. The South Ronaldsay, the southernmost population, was actually removed at that point, and sightings of stoats from that area stopped for 2 years. However, the volunteer trapping did not remove the northern population, and unfortunately that spread and has recolonised across the whole of the Orkney mainland and the connected southern Isles of Burry and South Ronaldsay. It's useful to understand, when we're putting together a funding bid, the dynamics of running a volunteer trapping project, and that has actually shown us some quite interesting information about how you keep volunteers motivated and keep them engaged for the long term. So that's all been quite useful information. But we are quite clear that this is now beyond the rapid response and it's beyond the volunteer eradication project, and therefore we've put together a funding bid. We needed some justification for that funding bid, however. In 2015 we contracted Xavier Lambin, Emil Sellers and Elaine Fraser to assess the risks to the Orkney wildlife, to give us the real understanding of why the stoat threat was important. Their report was absolutely crystal clear. It is highly likely that the introduction of stoats will profoundly change the ecology of Orkney and its value for birds of prey and the SPAs that it's designated for it. The critical linkage that they demonstrated was the predation on the Orkney vole and the interrelationship between the hen harrier and the short-eared owl, who very much rely on the Orkney vole. And there's direct predation, obviously, on wading and ground nesting birds. This slide simply just shows from public sightings data the spread of stoats on Orkney. We have a very good public sightings system, but it only can ever be as good as the people reporting them to us. But it just shows that the spread has now pretty much taken up the whole of the mainland. Caution, though, this doesn't tell you the extent and population. It just tells you where the stoats are being seen, and of course that really just maps where people actually live and work. So in 2016, SNH and RSPB Scotland formed a formal partnership to develop the Orkney Native Wildlife Project. And I'm going to hand over to Sarah to take you through some of the steps from there.
Thanks, Graham. So true partnership, we're sharing the talk, which is very good. So once we'd known that our actions had failed to date, we sort of started at the beginning where we should have started in the first place, and we commissioned a feasibility study and a biosecurity plan, which Grant Harper wrote for us. So a few of the things I'll say about the feasibility study. So it's good that we're thinking big this week at the moment. Orkney, the affected area is over 50,000 hectares, but the feasibility study says that we can do it. We can remove stoats. But there are some issues. So we're very limited in what we can use to actually remove stoats from Orkney. So Biz was talking about helicopters. No, we can't use them. But also, we can't use bait stations either. We're restricted to kill traps, and that's only dock traps at the moment, and hopefully good nature traps in the future. And we can use dogs to search for, but not to remove stoats. So we're very limited. We don't know the home range of stoats in Orkney, but we have an abundant food source, which Graham was just describing. So the feasibility study says don't delay now. What we should do is work on the basis of the smallest female home range size, which is about 5 hectares. So scale that up over the affected area, and we have 10,000 traps at 16 per kilometre squared. So it's a lot of traps that we're going to be running. One of the unique aspects of this from a stoat point of view is the human population. So we've just been hearing about populations of 80 people. We've got 20,000 people in Orkney. Put out 10,000 traps, nearly everybody is going to have a trap on their land. The other unique thing is we don't know much about how stoats interact with the urban environment, farms, gardens. We don't know much about that. The other thing that feasibility study said is that neither organisation has the finance to do this at the moment. Now, unfortunately in Scotland, our government hasn't ring-fenced a source of funding for invasive species. So every eradication, we know it's costly, we have to go looking for extra money. And in this case, the time delay may well be critical. Stoats can't swim back to Orkney from the Scottish mainland. So the biosecurity measures that we can use are considered sufficient to ensure that we don't get stoats back. So that's a big public engagement campaign to stop deliberate introduction, and then a quarantine and searching of cargoes such as straw and hay. Now, both feasibility study and biosecurity plan said we can't sit on our laurels whilst we wait for money. We actually have to get out there and do some immediate biosecurity measures. So you can see we've got stoats all over the place, but we've got another 60 plus islands that are stoat free. Some of those islands are very challenging. They've got very few roads and they're very remote, and quite a lot of them have no people on them. So what we've done is we set up a sort of emergency rapid response kit. It's small because we don't have the resources at the moment, but we've already utilised it on one island. And the other thing that we're doing is a containment trapping on Orkney mainland. So what we've identified is 5 areas in the biosecurity plan where there are islands within swimming distance from the current affected areas. And what we're going to do in those areas very shortly, they're about 1 kilometre deep. We're going to put dock traps out at about 10 per kilometre squared, and we are going to trap stoats, starting with 2 weekly traps and then moving on to monthly traps, and then going back to 2 weeks when the juveniles disperse. So this is thought essential to try and stop stoats from swimming, but also to try and create free habitat. So, because at the moment, the way our sightings are, we think stoats are at or near carrying capacity where they are, and we all know that that is when they like to disperse. So we're trying to put a sticking plaster on whilst we get the money. So as well as those aspects of things, we've also been working hard on the rest of the project. So we had some rough costs from the feasibility study. What we've done is add to those, so we've added a significant community engagement component to a project. And we've also added monitoring of our native wildlife so we can show the success of the project. And we've come up with a 5-year project, which is £4.5 million. I don't think that should be a surprise given the scale of operation that we're talking about here. So certainly a big project. We're trying to, so we've identified a need for a development phase, and in that development phase, we're going to address some of the issues that the feasibility study, the biosecurity plan, and our technical advisory group have come up with, particularly looking at novel ways to engage with the community, because we are going to need everybody on our side, and we want to use that time to create a big community engagement program. We also want to trial our traps. So we know very little about trapping in urban environments, but we know very little about trapping stoats in the UK. So we want to look at different traps, different housing, different baits, different lures, so that we make sure when we roll it out, we've got the best things possible. We've got commitment from RSPB and SNH in terms of funding. We're seeking commitment from our local authority as a partner and also as a funder. And we're getting commitment from stakeholders. So we're working very hard at the moment on an access protocol with the NFUS and the Department for Agriculture. We have now submitted a bid to HLF, but that still leaves a significant hole if we're successful. So also we're working hard on looking for match funding, not only for the delivery phase, but also for ongoing biosecurity measures, which we think will be about £100,000 a year. So currently we're looking at LIFE and some other funders for that funding. We hope to start the development phase very soon. It's going to be about 9 months, and then we want to get into the eradication. So hopefully soon we'll have the largest stoat eradication in the world. Thank you.
Thank you both. Actually, we've got time for a couple of questions. Tony.
Graham, I have a question for you, sir. Clearly the delay in responding to the initial incursion has been extremely costly, financially and biologically. What can we learn about that delay? And were there to be a similar incursion in another archipelago in Scotland, what would be different today?
I think the first thing is to actually, I think we all can accept that volunteer trapping is, whilst well-meaning, it doesn't necessarily equate to a full eradication or a full removal. So that's one thing, to be absolutely honest, you need to make a decision that you need to go for professional eradication if that's the scale that you're dealing with. I think secondly, there's the point about just the realistics of finance. If we had money 3-4 years ago to just get on with it and do it, we would have done that. But even seeking that amount of finance is difficult, and public sector purses are getting much, much tighter. So even to get to a point where we could realistically achieve a removal at, it's £300,000, £400,000, £500,000 as opposed to a £4.5 million project, still took quite a long time. So I mean, I think there is something for us as a community to reflect on, but also within the public sector to reflect on that.
Another question there.
I really enjoyed that. I have a question regarding the map that you showed somewhere in the presentation. You said that you don't have a clear idea of how these stoats respond to urban environments, but you see actually that I think the distribution follows the roads really neatly. Do you think that's a bias of where these?
I think it's a bias of where people are seeing them. Right. People are reporting sightings to us because they're driving along the road and they're seeing a stoat along the roadside, or they're working along the roadside. So, do take care with that map, because it's not an indicator of where the stoats are. It's an indicator of where people see them. Yeah.
But stoats have certainly been seen in people's gardens in the middle of towns and cities.
I did note that your distribution map, to a degree, mapped also the main roads.
Oh, completely.
Yes.
Yes.
So, the traps will be put out absolutely everywhere, because we're fairly certain that they are absolutely everywhere. It's just we don't have any observer effort in the moorlands, for example.
No more questions? Oh, one more here.
Just taking advantage of the next highlighted speaker to come this evening, is there not a case for government partners to make an argument on precautionary grounds on the fiscal costs of not tackling invasives sooner as opposed to later?
Do you want to answer that, Graham?
Convince the Treasury of that as a fiscal
Yes.
prudent measure.
Yes, it's absolutely necessary. I mean, we're sitting here looking for £4.5 million, whereas we could have been looking for a couple of £100,000 some years ago.
Okay, fine. Just as an aside, I mean, what you're heading towards is a hugely expensive programme to deal with one mustelid. And if I went back 30 years, I remember leading for what was then the Nature Conservancy Council in opposing a mink farm on Westray. And there you have a highly aquatic mustelid that, quite frankly, would have been horrendous in those islands. But anyway, could I thank you both, Sarah and Graham? Thank you. Now, our last talk in this session is of a species that you wouldn't necessarily think of as an invasive, insofar as it's a native of the UK. But of course, if you put a native of the UK in a place where it shouldn't be, you've got a problem. So our last talk is by Charles Thompson on hedgehogs in the UIST, that's in the Western Isles of Scotland. Thank you.
Thompson from the UIST. I'm the project officer for the UIST Wader project. I've been working on this project for 13 years.
Charles, just 1 second, we can't hear you.
Is that better? Okay. The UIST Wader project began in 2000 in response to declining populations of internationally important ground nesting waders in UIST. As you can see there, UIST is made up of 3 major islands: North UIST at the top, then Benbecula in the middle there, and South UIST at the bottom. These are all located on the west coast of Scotland, as you can see on the map on the right. A broad sandy plain known as Macha runs the length of the west coast of these islands, and this supports some of the highest densities of breeding waders found anywhere in Europe. Between 1983 and 2000 in South UIST and Benbecula, lapwing declined by 31%, Dunlin declined by 56%, redshank by 41%, snipe by 57%, ringed plover by 53%, and oystercatcher actually increased by 21%. So all these percentage changes relate to South UIST and Benbecula. Over the same period of time, in North UIST, all these species of wader actually increased. So we had to find out what the problem was, what was going on here. The main factor causing these declines in South UIST and Benbecula was found through extensive research to be hedgehogs predating nests. Hedgehogs are native to Great Britain, but not its offshore islands. Our research did not point to significant predation of waders by feral cats, rats, mink, ferrets, otters, which are also present in UIST. We do know that a small number of hedgehogs were introduced to the southern end of South UIST in 1974. By 2003, it was estimated that the hedgehog population had increased to about 4,000. They spread out across South UIST, Benbecula, and started to colonize the southern sector of North UIST. So our first objective was to try and establish the extent of the hedgehog population in North UIST, Benbecula, and South UIST, And the key information was found through footprint monitoring using clay, sand, or carbon substrates. That's an example of a clay substrate. Camera monitoring using motion-triggered video cameras. And sniffer dog monitoring using specially trained dogs and handlers. And also reports from the general public to help identify the whereabouts of hedgehogs in UIST. So it was vital to make some logical scientific sense of all this monitoring information in order to measure the size of the hedgehog population, as well as to measure the impact of our removal activities. This was achieved by using the footprint and camera monitoring data and feeding into a suitable index of abundance model. The single-season heterogeneity Royal Nichols model was found to be the best fit for this data. And so what you can see there in those maps for 2003 and 2013 and 2014 in North UIST, you can see samples of areas where we measured the index of abundance. And likewise for South UIST and Benbecula, there's further samples. Just note that the higher the index, the more abundant the hedgehogs are. So there were three key methods for removing hedgehogs at our disposal at that point. The first, lamping hedgehogs proved to be effective on short crop vegetation, but not so good on the thicker, taller vegetation. Also, it involves working at night, and it can cause difficulties with the local community in terms of disturbance. Trapping works well on all types of habitat, and it's capable of removing 80 to 90% of the hedgehogs from a given area over an 8-week period. The traps are installed in like a grid formation, and they're at a density of between 30 to 50 traps per kilometre square. An experienced dog handler and his or her dog can locate just about any hedgehog. Can cover 2 kilometres square per week, and training can take 1 to 2 years to get somebody up to scratch to be effective with such a thing. Labrador, Collie and Pointer are all proven breeds of dog that are capable of searching for hedgehogs. So what we did next, we needed to see what combination of removal methods would be effective over a given period of time. This was achieved by carrying out a research trial at Drumore, which is in South UIST, where a 2 kilometre square area of land was monitored for a 4-week period, resulting in a very high index of abundance. We then trapped and sniffer dog searched this area for a period of 8 weeks. We removed 64 hedgehogs, and you can see by the graph there that the majority of the hedgehogs were removed within the first 2 weeks. The remainder tailed off towards 0 after 8 weeks. Finally, we monitored the area for another 4 weeks, where an index of abundance of 0 was found, which represents no hedgehogs. We were quite confident that this demonstrated that we could remove all the hedgehogs from a given area of land in an 8-week period. So in the early stages of the project, we removed all the hedgehogs from Carinish and Loch Eport, which are the two areas shaded there. All the areas shown in the map there were monitored, but hedgehogs were only found in the core areas of Carinish and Loch Eport, where the habitat was suitable. We were unable to use sniffer dogs at this time because of legal reasons. But we were still successful in clearing these areas over an 8-year period. If you note that the 2 years at the end, 2009 and 10, there's 2 zeros there. We caught no hedgehogs at the end. And so those 2 years helped verify eradication for those for that particular area. So in 2012, one hedgehog was located in Loch Porton, which is the east side of North UIST there, shaded in blue. But due to staff resource limitations, we were not able to apply a substantial effort into this area until 2015. During 2015, over a 10-week period, we removed almost all the hedgehogs from that area. The amount of effort deployed matches very closely what was done at the Dromore trial, and we can actually compare the graphs. Well, you know, there's a similar pattern there, but two very different starting populations of hedgehogs. What we believe is this supports the theory that it takes the same amount of effort to clear a given area of hedgehog habitat, regardless of the starting population density of hedgehogs. One additional hedgehog was found the following year in 2016, and since then, none have been detected, so we're quite confident we've cleared that area as well. The final area was at Balranald and Pable, and the key area here is the light shaded area to the west. This is where the habitat is most suitable. This was the largest population of hedgehogs in North UIST, and we only became really effective at eradication when we had a full complement of sniffer dogs at our disposal, and that was only from 2013. So the graph leading up to 2013, you can see why it's not got that declining effect. SNH has agreed that eradication will be confirmed when 2 years monitoring has been completed without finding any hedgehogs. So far, the monitoring of all areas of North UIST has resulted in just one hedgehog so far in 2017. That's the centre of that circle. This solitary hedgehog was located on camera as well as being found by sniffer dogs 10 days later. And so what we did is we created a buffer area of a 1 kilometre radius from where the hedgehog was located, and searched this rigorously with sniffer dogs and trap checks over a 4-week period. No further hedgehogs were located, so that's a positive one. So what we feel is we've successfully demonstrated techniques to capture hedgehogs that will reduce the population to zero over a given period of time. We're now in the process of investigating sources of funding for a larger scale eradication project to remove the remaining hedgehogs from Benbecula and South UIST. This will require clearing an area of almost 400 kilometres square, although we can probably reduce this to roughly 200 kilometres square, which represents the suitable habitat for hedgehogs. Using the Dromore method, it's been calculated that 18 staff would be required, and it would take 5 years to remove all the hedgehogs, and this would cost approximately 3.5 million. Lastly but not least, I should thank the RSPB for all their partnership support to date, and the further investigation they're going into to try and find a means of raising this funding. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Charles. We've got literally a couple of minutes if there's any questions out there. Right.
As one of the two people who was responsible for measuring the highest wavelengths being recorded in North and South UIST, I wish you well on this. It would be a tragedy if that hugely important world's-class area were not recovered in due time. I commend you for what you've done so far. Wish you well and much energy in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
One more question.
Similar theme. What do you do with all the hedgehogs?
Okay. Yeah, that's a tricky question. Up until the end of 2006, we were euthanizing the hedgehogs, killing them on the island. Then some research was done at Bristol University that suggested that translocating them to the mainland would be successful and most of them would survive. Based on that evidence and also on SSPC advice, we changed our policy and started translocating hedgehogs as from then. So all hedgehogs that are captured are moved to the Scottish mainland.
Is there no genetic disparity between sort of UIST hedgehogs actually to the ERADICATION hedgehogs, who are bigger, smaller, faster, quicker?
The site of the release sites for the hedgehogs on the Scottish mainland are very carefully chosen. So we don't look to overflow an area with hedgehogs that are translocated in. We're looking very carefully at predators and reasons why areas don't have hedgehogs. So there's a lot of work goes into that. And what we've found so far, that the hedgehogs that have been released appear to have done pretty much okay. So it's been successful.
Okay, Charles, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, we've had 4 very interesting presentations this afternoon, and could I thank all 5 speakers. We've got tea now, and just to make sure that we can start the next session on time, could I ask you to be back by 3:25 in the room? Thank you very much indeed.